Hi, my name's Sarah and I'm the local food officer at the Surf Coast Shire Council. And welcome to my garden. In this episode, we're looking at composting and worm farming, something that every garden should have. And again, this week I have Ben and James joining me. So without further ado, let's dig in.
All right, thank you, Sarah. Great to be back here in your backyard again, and away from our digital workshop last week. COVID-19 certainly been hard taking the gardeners out of the garden, but we're back here, so it's good to be back. Obviously, as we've been filming the last few weeks, we have been together. We are taking in mind the isolation or distancing, so we will be distancing throughout this book as well, doing our best. So in theme with all the other workshops, this is our fourth one now, we're going to be focusing on composting and worm farms today. So I guess the whole the series we've been doing is all about growing food. So it's specifically talking about composting and worm farms to growing food. And I guess the key link there is healthy soil. So putting nutrients back into the soil, which we'll be talking more about throughout our session. So a question, why do we compost? We've got, I mean, it's a number of reasons. Obviously, gardeners compost for many different reasons, but there are some great benefits to composting. As I mentioned, we are essentially recycling waste products, the nutrients from those waste products, and putting it into the soil, so nutrient replacement into the soil. And as we've said, that's probably our catchphrase: healthy soil, healthy food, healthy people. So that's the key reason why we compost. Reducing household waste as well. So if you think about your land, so the average landfill bin in the Surf Coast Shire is around 52% organic waste. Okay, so if we actually take out 52% of your bin, we're reducing the amount of landfill sent to or waste sent to landfill every week dramatically. So we are doing it. We can do that through composting and through worm farms. When we talk about organic waste as well, I'll quickly mention that it's not just food scraps. So we'll be talking about carbon and nitrogen today, and different things we can compost and how we compost that. But if you think of things like tea bags or coffee grinds, or even hair clippings, nail finger clippings, vacuum cleaner dust, all these things we can actually compost in certain ways. Okay, so it's not just food scraps when we talk about organic waste. The other thing is we've talked about in the past, when we're doing our lasagna layering in the first week, where we're using waste as a resource here. So it's using it as a benefit and using it to our advantage. So it's a pretty important thing, I think. So we're going to be talking about different methods today. We've got some worm farms over here. We've got some standard compost bins, but we're going to start off with talking about compost bays. So I might throw over to you, Ben, and you might notice as well that Ben and I have gone to a lot of effort today to dress in uniform. This is our gardening uniform.
Hang on. Will we put our uniform?
Yeah. We're the boys in the hood.
Okay, dad joke aside. Okay, well, welcome this morning. I think with this last of this beautiful weather, probably before the weekend, a lot of you might be down the beach, but hopefully you can tune back in because we're recording all these as well. But if you are sitting there with a cuppa, welcome. This is a topic that we're pretty excited about because really good gardens start with, I think, good composting systems. So James has alluded to a few different ways that we can compost. And he also mentioned waste. That word in itself is, I think, problematic in that, if you're in the kitchen, you chop up all your veggie scraps and they go into your bin, and this is more a chooky bucket. I don't know if it's a kitchen waste bucket, but I want to get across that this stuff is not waste, it's gold. We want this going back through our system. If you want healthy veggies, this is one big, and healthy fruit trees, this is one big component which we can use. So let's start thinking about your chooky bucket or your bucket in your kitchen as the gold, not waste. So what I want to get across today is, so we've been composting in many different ways over the years, and I suppose we wanted today to sort of make it a bit easier and a bit more accessible for people to not be too scared about compost. So often you hear about compost systems, you know, all the problems that we can have with compost systems, like rats, and it stinks and smells bad, and they seem to be quite problematic. So today we're going to try and, I don't know, glorify compost. That's right. We'll, you know, we'll be rolling around in this stuff, not you and I, but yeah, we'll be. What we're wanting to make, Sarah, we're in Sarah's garden again in beautiful Torquay. We're wanting to make beautiful, beautiful compost. Look at this stuff. Now
It doesn't smell, man.
No, I could even just rub it on my face as a, you know, look at this. Look at that. Good for your skin. Everyone's going, ew, at home. Sarah's going, you realise what I put into that? No. Anyway, I've got dirt all over my face. This is what we're trying to produce. So I'm going to talk about a few different methods. Now, I think you can see here. Sarah, can you see that? Okay, a lot of people will go with this method for composting at home. Now, we'll make a point that everyone's got different space at home. You might be in a unit. It might be easier to compost using a worm farm, which James is going to expand on later. These are a great way to compost at home. So we might just talk about bins first. One thing we talked about before was rats. Now, Sarah hasn't got one of these on the bottom, but I believe she uses them as well. But to keep rats out, you can just put a wire base underneath and you can just roll it over the edges. And that's a very quick way to eliminate rats coming into your composting system. The other good thing about these is, you know, you can gradually build it up. So you're not going to make a compost overnight, obviously. It takes time to fill these bays or bins with all the ingredients. Now, we've got a lot of ingredients where we're going to build a compost today. But generally speaking, you're going to chuck your scraps in, you're going to be adding things to these composting systems, and they take time. This is a system where you can't really turn it that easily. Although, James, do you want to pass us the... Thank you, sir. This is a good little tool that can speed up the process. And you're just aerating the compost. So I use, in my home, all of the different methods to compost because it's a great way of building soil. So we're using worm farms. I use a couple of bins at home. The other thing about bins is you can strategically locate them under fruit trees, which Sarah's done here as well. The beauty is once your compost is finished, you lift it off. You don't have to put it in a wheelbarrow. You can just spread it across your fruit trees or put it in a spot which is close and easy to distribute across your garden. It's a really good tip because there's a lot of weight there and it's a lot of effort. But if it's straight under your fruit trees, the other thing is your fruit trees are loving a compost sitting right underneath them because they're enjoying all the nutrients that you're feeding to it. So we can fill our bins up. We're going to talk about nitrogen and carbon. This is probably something that scares a lot of people.
So Ben, can we do that now? Because we've got a beautiful, as you mentioned, a beautiful bucket here of food scraps. Yep. So what is this? Is this nitrogen or carbon?
That is nitrogen. You can look at it as greens as well.
Yep.
We're trying to get a good balance. When we talk about, you know, layering lasagnas like we've done in previous workshops with our no dig, it's no different to your composting system. You need to have a good ratio of carbon to nitrogen. Now, this is where people, if you're reading at home, you're looking at composting books, people get a bit freaked out, I think. And it's like 2 to 1, is it 3 to 1? You know, if I'm not that flash at maths, I was okay at it. But I think it comes with experience, and we'll give some general tips today that hopefully you can just have a go. You know, often, you know, a lot of composts, when they get stinky, have too much of the nitrogen. So if you're creating a lot of, you know, you've got into cooking at home during this COVID experience and you're doing a lot of cooking, you've got more scraps. If you're just putting scraps every day into the bin and you're not adding that carbon layer, you're going to have that smelly, wet, horrible sort of compost that people may have experienced. So we're going to talk about how we can balance things out, but not get too technical.
If your compost is bubbling, it's probably a good sign of too much nitrogen.
And it could be a good social or a good experiment with the kids at home, but we probably don't. We're trying to avoid that experience. So
think of the nitrogen as the greens, as the wet stuff, the food scraps, the lawn clippings, and the carbon as the dry stuff. So the straw or the cardboard or newspaper, and you do need to balance it out nicely with carbon and nitrogen.
And a general rule of thumb is having more carbon to nitrogen. So I've heard various measurements as what works best, but let's face it, you're not going to get this at home and put it on the scales and then get this on the scales. It's just, we're all lead busy lives. We want this to be a relatively easy process, and don't be scared to actually have a go, because creating compost is one of the funner things you'll do, I reckon, James.
As we just saw by you exfoliating with it then.
That's right. I mean, you want to be creating this lovely stuff, popping it in your garden, and of course your plants are going to respond to that. That's a very different experience of going down to the hardware store and buying a bag of soil. It's not that flashy for your garden. So I reckon we might build.
Great. Let's do it.
Let's build it. So we've talked a little bit about the bins. So generally what I didn't, and this goes with all the layers we're creating today. We'll talk about worm farms separately, but whether it's a bin or your bales, generally we like to put down a carbon layer first. Now these bales could be, compost bays can be made out of timber, they can be made out of old pallets, they can be made out of corrugated iron. The reason why I'm using pea straw or straw bales is that these really keep your system, the general principle is these composts themselves gradually, slowly will break down. And when they've got to a level where they're falling apart, they go back on your garden. So every year I buy about 20 bales, which go through my whole system at home. And that just feeds the soil. Like when these, start falling apart and you take them out, there's so many worms, there's so much life there. So these are a really cheap, easy alternative to building a compost. We've built our compost bays in, 3 seconds.
And a great way also that, this could be a future garden bed for Sarah. So in 12 months time, it's no longer going to be a composting area. It's going to be a new garden bed. And then, her composting bay will be somewhere else in the garden. So don't be set on that. Well, that's our composting area. It can move on as well.
Yeah, this is going to be, Sarah's hoping to plant a bit of a citrus orchard around the fire pit here, which would be amazing. And this is a great way to prepare your soil. What I will say is that at home, I use this system in my chicken run. So my composting bay is with my chooks. And when these break down, the chooks love it. You just spread it across and they're having an absolute party. All right, so we'll do first layer. And also when I'm at home with chickens, one of my first layers is actually mixing up in a bucket all the chicken poo comes out of the tray with paper that I tear up. I got that as a good tip from a really good gardener in Geelong. So I've done layers where I just literally pop the paper straight on. Sarah, I don't know if you want to lift the camera up, you can. Again, don't use glossy magazines or anything with lots of nasties in them. But I've done layers like this, and it's worked for me in the past, where you just put the paper down, just like we did in that no-dig garden. You can shred it as well. You can roll around. Now, you do need to give it a bit of a water. But if you don't have newspaper, the first layer, I always think, is a really good layer of carbon. So this is pea straw. Now don't just put it in biscuits, you want it to aerate. So, and generally you can put, I sort of say you can do like 20 centimeters, I don't know, like that much as a layer. But if you put this on the bottom, the beauty is once you're putting some of those heavier materials on top, like grass clippings or your scraps from the kitchen, which have, you know, a bit of water in them, well, this will sit down. So we've got a layer of carbon. Now we need a layer of nitrogen. So nitrogen, what we might do, what have we got? Some weeds. Some weeds. Beautiful. Now that's probably not quite enough as a layer. So what we might do is put some of our scraps. Now, one thing I will say when you're at home with your scraps, when you're cleaning your plate or your porridge bowl or whatever it is, and you're adding a bit of water, put that water in with your, like that's just another resource, water, and that, you know, will keep your compost nice and wet. So spread it around. What a lovely layer. And again, if you can chop those ingredients up smaller, your compost will work faster. There's coffee grounds, there's cabbage, there's corn, there's little bits of bread, capsicums. You know, there's lots of things in here that are really going to get our garden going. Now, this is one of the biggest tips that I'll say that will help you with composting, is always to have a carbon layer near, whether it's your bin, whether it's these bays, have it near, have it easy. When you do put your scraps out, you're not liking to put on top, because when this is exposed, that's when you're going to invite the rats and things that you don't want in your garden, obviously, in. So if I've just come from the kitchen, turfed it in here, great. Where's the next layer? Here's a layer of sawdust. So again, I collect sawdust from a furniture maker in Geelong, but this is Rich is doing some woodwork, or I'm not sure what he's been doing, but this has been saved. This hasn't been thrown out. So again, I don't know if we can see that. So giving that a good covering. And you might think that's not quite enough. Again, you can add a bit more. So what we're doing is creating this real lasagna again of ingredients. You can already see I'm filling up area here. And generally speaking, just area size, 1 square meters, fine with bales, it sort of creates that perfect sort of the conditions to make really lovely compost. Now the difference between this method and the bin is that once you fill this and starts breaking down, and hopefully you've got that carbon and nitrogen ratio, you know, going pretty well, we've got another bale or system here, which is ready to go once you want to turn it. So turn it, that aerates it, that gets you everything happening in your compost that you want to. You've turned it, you can start making a new one. So I've got 3 of these at home. We've just got 2 set up here today. And you know, putting it near plants is fine. I've had really good success putting my compost with my raspberries. They've just gone berserk. So that was just another layer. So cardboard. You know, I don't think you need to get too technical with compost. If you do, you probably won't do it. If you're one of those people at home that really, you know, take a cooking analogy, you have to measure out, you know, you're baking a cake and you have to do it all perfectly. If you apply that to your garden, you're probably less likely to be a bit more freer. I've made really good compost over the years and not being too precious about it. So, got some nice leaves from the locust tree just here. Bit of straw that's fallen out of the garden beds. And the other really, another layer that you can put on. Look at that beautiful sheep poo. You can see I'm not being too technical about it. Generally though, if you can do a carbon, nitrogen, it's going to work pretty well. But sometimes you won't have all those lovely ingredients on hand. We've got, you know, Sarah's pruned some of her herbs here. Oh, it smells amazing. My goodness. You know, eggplant cut up really finely. How good's this? Now, one other brilliant ingredient. Coffee ground. Again, not too many. So you notice I'm not being too precious without, oh crikey, I haven't got the nitrogen, I'm comfortable because I've had experience on, you know, sometimes your compost will go quicker if you do it really, really well with your levels. But if you've got it and it's in the garden, why not use it through your compost? Now, what I put on my face earlier on, which I'm starting to regret. No, I'm just kidding. So this is some compost that Sarah's made. Some that we prepared earlier. This is a great compost activator. That's just going to get things happening even faster in your compost. So, you know, if you've got some beautiful compost that you've prepared, don't put it all on your veggie beds. You can put it through as a layer in your compost again. So already we're starting to half fill this. Now I'm not going to go through the whole process and get to the very top, but again, carbon, nitrogen, have a bit of fun with it. Don't worry too much as long as we're not leaving it exposed. That's a key point. Always have that carbon layer to throw on top. Have I missed anything, James? You reckon?
No, sounds pretty thorough to me.
You can give it a bit of water. And voila. Now, ideally, you'll fill that up. So if you've got all the ingredients, but if not, that's okay. You can gradually fill it up as we go. I might throw to you, mate. You want to talk about
we'll do some worms. Just one other thing with the compost. It is like, because we live in a temperate climate here, and we do just, you know, get those summer 47-degree days and those bitterly cold mornings here in the Surf Coast. It is an idea to actually insulate your compost as well, and that can be done quite easily with either a hessian bag or a layer of carpet, particularly in those really peak times of year, the hot times and the cold times, just to keep it more at a constant temperature. I've found that does help in the past too.
That's a good point.
But yeah, as Ben said, the small bin is a great one for a small space. You need less than a metre squared. This one, if you've got more space readily available, fantastic. Whereas the worm farm is great in tiny environments. I've seen them in courtyards and even on balconies where they can be really quite productive. So we are going to move around here so you can see. Pause on.
Yeah.
Unless there's people. Oh, hello, Suzanne. How are you?
You've got your molasses.
I believe I just put dirt away.
That was great. Ready.
Okay, so we've got Sarah's worms farm here. And we've got another one as an example too. So we're going to be talking a little bit about worm farms, the benefits of them, and how easy they are too. Now, worms, I'll start off, I think they're probably one of my favourite animals. They are phenomenal animals. Keeping in mind that worms come in thousands of different species of worms. Compost worms are different to earthworms. Okay, so you can definitely introduce composting worms into your gardens, but it is actually different to the worms that are there originally, and they eat different things. Okay, so if you do put composting worms into your gardens, fine, but you actually need to continue to feed them food scraps as well. Okay, if you were to dig out earthworms and stick them in here and feed them food scraps, they wouldn't survive. They would not do the same thing because earthworms actually eat dead leaf litter or grass or root systems and things and soil, not the food scraps. Okay, so these are both pretty standard worm farms that you can buy from your hardware store. To set one up, you're looking at about around this sort of $80 to $90 mark, including worms, and you're ready to go. You can, however, drive around the streets of Torquay and often find these sitting on the side of the roads for water pickup. Not that we're recommending hard waste, but they're also readily available. I've picked one up from the Anglesey Tip Shop for $5, and you often see them on online platforms saying for free, come and grab them. So you can get them really easily, and you can set them up out of old plastic tubs, polystyrene boxes. So it's not just, you don't have to go down and buy one brand new. In saying that, they are fantastic. One, you can get the worm castings out, which we'll go through in a second, and two, you get the worm way out as well. So I'll go through how this basically works, and then we'll look at the insides as well. So at the top, worms need air, obviously, to breathe. They breathe through their skin. So they've got ventilation holes here. They also like it quite dark. Okay, so through the day, they'll often go down, sort of lower down into the worm farm. If they're exposed to sunlight for sort of particularly when it's hot, but any longer than an hour, they'll pretty much die. Okay, so they need that fluid around them, which is interesting enough, held to them by this fine hair layer. So they've got like a beard. They're pretty much like hipsters. They love growing beards. They love coffee as well. They haven't never seen one on a bike. So that's our roof of our house, if you want to put it as a house. The top layer, so it comes in layers, and if I look at this one over here, so this is the layer. It's basically got fine holes through it, which the worms can fit through. Even the fatter composting worms can fit through these holes. They can or their kitchen. So this is where the worms eat. Okay, so this is the only place that you would put food if you're feeding the worms. Now Sarah's got a pretty fancy, think of this as like your insulation in your ceiling. Okay, so this is going to keep the worms at a sort of pretty constant temperature. It also keeps them nice and moist as well. They do like it moist. They don't like it too wet though. They can actually drown. So within here, I will show you, we've got all the Sarah's residue food scraps in here. Okay. Now, with the food scraps, worms don't actually eat the food. They actually eat the bacteria around the food as it starts decomposing. Okay. Now this doesn't smell at all, so they actually get to it pretty quickly. But for a lettuce like this, they won't start eating that until it starts rotting. Okay. Worms can eat their weight, their body weight a day in food. So they're pretty amazing composters. In a worm farm like this, we're going to have probably, a few thousand. So they're going to be eating quite a bit of food scraps in a day. And if we think about an average household, a worm farm like this can do about 4 kilos a week of food. So they're pretty quick to turn food into a really valuable resource. I've got some. Let's have a look. Here we go. So people are often scared of worm farms, thinking that it brings in maggots and whatever. Now these guys here, you can see are tiny little baby worms. Okay, so even there in my hand, I've got a few hundred worms at the moment. Worms are hermaphrodites, and this big worm here is so male and female at the same time, essentially. So it has the capability of laying about 80 eggs a year. So if you have a handful of worms, say 100 worms, they're going to actually populate really quickly, and they will increase their population depending on how much food you give them. So the more food you give them, the more worms you'll have, and if you sort of go away for a month, they will decline in population. But those baby worms will grow into healthy, thriving composting worms in no time at all. If you pick through really carefully, you'll find these little eggs that look like sort of tiny little lemons. And yeah, that's their eggs. So they're pretty interesting. These worms are, as I mentioned, composting worms. These ones specifically are tiger worms. Okay, you almost will certainly probably find red wigglers in there as well. Both great at breaking down our food scraps. So if we look through the next layer, what I'll do is I'll take this one off the top. Okay, this one's heavy. This is full of beautiful worm castings. And not going to rub it on my face, but it doesn't smell. It is sensational. What worm castings is essentially worm poo. Now I do lots of sessions with school groups, and I always pass it around first of all and get kids to smell it before they even know what it is and say, what does it smell like? And it often doesn't smell, or it smells quite sweet, and they're like, oh, it smells like chocolate. This is like chocolate for your garden. Okay, it is amazing. Yeah, as we said before at the start, it is recycling nutrients from your food waste and putting it back into the soil. So this stuff is gold. To get this out, now this one is quite full, okay? So to get it out, the best thing to do is we can use the lid, turn it upside down. We can then tip this guy on top, like so, and then we can sit it in a sunny spot. So if I was to sit it over here for about 15 minutes, what's going to happen is the worms are going to go, sun, I don't like this, and they're going to go down as far as they can, okay? Even better, if I was to do it on my worm farm, they're going to go down through the layers and escape from that sun. So then within sort of, 20 minutes, half an hour, pretty certain that most of the top layer is going to be free from worms. And I can start scraping off the worm castings with a trowel and get some of these out. Instead of getting them out now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually just lift up and get some worms out for you. Here we go, beautiful worms. Now, if Sarah was, as we said a couple of weeks ago, the best thing for gardeners to do is to find gardening friends, whether it's getting cuttings or getting plants, or even better, getting worm farms established. To go around to a mate's place and get a handful of worms like this, that is invaluable for a gardener, and you'll have your own worm farm up and running in no time. So that is what you're after. Some healthy worms like that. They're really fat worms, really well-fed worms, and obviously producing some beautiful castings. Now, as I mentioned as well, along with the worm castings, you get the worm weed. Okay, so think of this layer as like their lounge room. This is where they're lounging around through the day, hanging out, going up for a bite to eat, and then going down to their bedroom. So they've got another layer here of castings. Okay, below this, we have pretty much like their bathroom or their toilet. This is where all the worm weed is caught. And if you can see down the bottom, there's a tap. So if we're to open up that tap, we get out worm weed, okay, or worm juice. And it is this beautiful liquid fertilizer that is ready to go for your garden. If I was to water that down about 1 litre to a watering can like this, I've got an amazing fertilizer which I can pour directly onto seedlings or plants, garden beds, to put those nutrients back into the soil. It's amazing as well. So you can't have enough of that stuff. And if you're feeding this correctly, you're probably going to get about 2 litres out of here a week of rich worm castings. So what do worms like to eat? I will get these guys out of the sun while I'm telling you, but worms love to eat basically finely chopped up raw foods, raw fruit and veg particularly. So an example here is juicings, juicing juice scraps, juicings, we'll call it juicings. So juice scraps are great because it's so fine. So that'll start rotting pretty quickly, and worms will be able to come up and start eating from that. So the finer it's chopped up, the better. They don't like to eat acidic foods. So things like meats, things like breads as well aren't great for the worms. Breads will actually go moldy and introduce bad bacteria into it. So not great in worm farms. Banana skins, fantastic. Lettuce, great. Apple peel. As I said before, coffee grinds. They love tea bags, eggshells. The more diverse nutrients you're putting into that worm farm, the healthier the castings are going to be, both the wheat and the castings. So the better for the garden, the better for your food you're growing. So keeping it diverse. Things like citrus isn't great. They will get through it, but it's quite acidic. Tomatoes, fine. There's lots of things I do like. So getting started. As I said before, there's lots of ways to get started. Either going down to your hardware store, looking around on Gumtree or wherever to see what you can find. If you do not know anyone with a worm farm and need to get some worms to get started, you can actually buy a box called Booster Box of Worms. So in this box, there is currently about 500 live worms in a bag, ready to go. Okay, I think a box like this is about $30 from hardware stores, and it's a great way to just get your worm farm up and running. However, the best way is to go out and find someone with a worm farm, go to a community garden, and talk to them there and get them that way. Now, to start off, you can do a few ways as well. If you're going to buy a booster box, you can buy coconut husk. Okay, is a great bedding for worms. They do love it, but there is plenty of other options you can use, and it's not sort of transported large distances to get here. This is a waste product though, but it probably comes about 2,000-3,000 k's if it's from Australia. So another alternative to this is, as Ben said before, carbon layer, whether it's straw or ripped up shredded newspaper, or even shredded office paper as well. Just keeping in mind, it's not that glossy stuff. It is just your normal paper is great. So if you haven't got access to this, or you don't want to spend lots of money on it, great, use newspaper, that is fine. Giving them you can use soil if you like as well, some sort of dead soil that you want to revitalise. But generally in worm farms, I can see that rich, beautiful soil looking stuff, but there's been no soil added to it, okay? The other thing is insulation. If you don't want to go out and buy one of these guys, an old Hessian bag. And as we said before, if you go to your local coffee roasters, get a Hessian bag from them, put it over the top. I've used towels, I've used cardboard, even eggshells, the large eggshell things you can put over the top. Keeping in mind, the worms will eat through this, and they'll eat through all those natural fibres as well. So keeping it natural is key too. But you want to make sure they're not getting too hot. So a nice shaded position, particularly from the west or the northwest, is key. Keeping the water up to them, so adding a bit of water every now and then, so it's flushing their castings through. And yeah, just generally loving them, looking after them, feeding them once a week is ideal, and it will basically put back into your garden and love your garden back. I reckon that's pretty much about it on worm farms. They're great. You can put them in any spot, any location. Probably a lot smaller than what Ben was saying about, you know, the pea straw bale compost system. Even smaller than your bin. But there's so many ways to compost. We've only touched on 3 ways today, but we really encourage you, if you are interested in gardening or starting out a garden, composting is a necessity, which will give so much back to your garden.
I totally agree.
Well, I hope you enjoyed today's episode and picked up a few new tips and tricks on composting and worm farming. I know I certainly did. Well, until next time, we'll see you later.